pundits fought over every issue under the sun, but agreed on one thing, that the incoming Congress are going to face significant economic challenges. We're going to be greeted by $17 trillion in debt, entitlement programs on the path to bankruptcy, widespread long-term unemployment, and a crumbling infrastructure, just to name a few minor issues. So the solutions out there are numerous. CED has taken positions on some of these, but unfortunately policy has become sometimes as polarized as politics. We have a distinguished panel here to discuss the competing economic visions. Here to host the conversation is David Wessel. David is the director of the Hutchins Center on Fiscal and Monetary Policy of the Brookings Institution here in DC. David came to Brookings after having spent nearly 30 years with the Wall Street Journal as the economics editor most recently. He appears on NPR's Morning Edition and has shared 2 Pulitzer Prizes for journalism. David and panelists, welcome.
Thank you very much. It's good to be here. I feel a little bit like what it must have been if you were captured by the East Germans with this light penetrating us. But so be it. So we have a really good group of people here. Washington actually at its best. Bill Hoagland, who's now at the Bipartisan Policy Center, but spent a couple decades in the Senate and a few years at Cigna, but he doesn't want to talk about that. Bill has been active in every serious debate about budgets and healthcare since I came to Washington nearly 30 years ago. Rudy Penner, of course, now at the Urban Institute, but was one of the directors of the Congressional Budget Office after it was founded by Alice Rivlin, the founding mother of the Congressional Budget Office, who's now a colleague of mine at the Brookings Institution, where she oversees the Engelberg Center on Health, and Neera Tanden, who has worked for the Clinton White House, the Obama White House, the Obama campaign, the Hillary Clinton campaign, and is now the head of CAP, Center for American Progress. And if you want more, there's lots, I think there's biographies here, and anyways, you already know who they are. So, when we first had a conversation about this panel, it was before the election, and I was in fear that we'd be here talking to you about the dynamics of the runoff in Georgia and how the balance of power in the Senate might not yet be resolved. But we had an election, there was a winner. And I think that I want to start with asking each of the panelists, so now what? I think the conventional wisdom in Washington is that not much is going to get done for the next 2 years. And I've asked each of the panelists to assign a probability that that's the outcome, that basically nothing much big gets done. Neera, do you want to start?
So I guess I would only say that I have a high probability not much will get done. Although, there's going to be a debate around the budget that will inevitably happen just because of the structure of decision making. And so I think that on big decisions, what to do about economic growth, in my mind, a lot of what was animating what happened on Election Day was that people are still pretty squeezed economically. The middle class, people trying to get in the middle class are still really hurting, and took that out on what they consider the incumbent party. And unfortunately, I don't think that those issues that animated voters are going to be front and center. It'll be the budget debate and what to do about the budget. You could connect those things, but that doesn't seem the direction of where we're heading. I do think, though, not to skip to the next election, but I do think those issues will be front and center in the presidential debate that will start coming soon.
Alice? I think you have you're sitting on your mic.
Not good to sit on the mic. I'm a professional optimist. I think what ought to happen is that the Republicans, now that they have shown how strong they are and control both houses, think ahead, and think ahead to the next few years when they might, they think, hope to regain the presidency. And their chances of doing that would seem to me to be much better if they had shown they could govern and get several major pieces of legislation through the Congress that the president would sign, and or at least not spend 2 years just bickering and obstructing. That's my hope. I don't know what probability to assign it, maybe 50-50, because it doesn't look like we're off to a very good start.
Rudy?
Well, when I'm on a panel with Alice, I have to be the professional pessimist. I don't expect a lot to be done, but that doesn't mean nothing. And it really depends on how the two sides behave. If the president rushes out and issues a whole bunch of contentious executive orders, it'll be a disaster. We'll essentially get nothing. If the Republicans close down the government, be a disaster, or make a big deal out of the debt ceiling. But nevertheless, even if everyone behaves well, it's hard to see any important resolution of our budget problems. But there are things that can be done. Top of my list would in fact be corporate tax reform. Both political parties want to do something about inversions. There are different approaches to that. But in theory, at least, they could get together. I think there are a lot of things that could be done just in terms of good government behavior. We could try to rationalize, things like our dozens of job training programs and things of that sort. So some good news is possible, but not a lot.
Right? One of my favorite quotes is from Lincoln, who said, "I am an optimist because I don't see the point in being anything else." I guess I'm here even with a higher degree of optimism. If you define stalemate, or if you define gridlock in this town as government shutdown, threat of default, not passing legislation, not passing a budget, no, that's it. I can say that's not going to happen. Congress will pass a budget. They will not shut down government. They will not go through a government default threat again. They will pass legislation. They will send legislation to the president. The question is whether or not the president is going to sign that legislation, or is he going to use his veto pen? I think he's only used it twice, and send it back to Congress. And I think the real threat going forward is that if we can't come together on some of these issues, we're going to have the cost to the American public will be, the cost to society will be that come 2016, we'll have an even more divided electorate out there, a more polarized country. We will have less turnout at the voting booth, and I show my ignorance of politics here. We'll have a Cruz, Warner type, Elizabeth Warren type candidates, and I think that's really not good. Now, in terms of the probability, I put a 80% probability of moving forward. I'm optimistic.
So your definition of moving forward is no default, no government shutdown, and they pass a single piece of legislation?
Pass legislation. I've got a lot of legislation. I thought we get to the legislation. I think they can pass.
Yeah, I'll get to that.
By the way, I was on a panel, I think with Rudy and Alice about in 2011 when I predicted without great fanfare that there was a 90% probability that the special committee, the super committee, would be successful. So don't take my prediction very.
Let the record show I agreed with that, and Rudy didn't.
So I want to dispense with that gloomy picture. My odds are 65% chance that nothing substantial gets done. I agree with Bill that they're not going to do another shutdown. That's highly unlikely. But there is some chance, each of you referred to a chance, that something substantial might get done in the economic sphere. I was interested, Rudy, that you picked corporate tax reform. I would have said trade. I would have said that there's a possibility that the Senate gives the president trade promotion authority, and that helps bring the Trans-Pacific Partnership along, because our negotiating partners recognize that, well, maybe he could actually get this done. But I'm interested, what would you put on the list of the most likely big things to get done if they do something, and what about trade?
Yeah, I mean, I actually would say trade is the most likely, probably, I would say significantly more likely than corporate tax reform. I mean, at CAP, we've been we've talked about the principles of corporate tax reform that are shared among some members of both parties. But that is a cleavage. There are cleavages on both sides of that set of issues. So, but I'm willing to be an optimist and think that's likely. I think Trade Promotion Authority is given the configuration in the Senate more likely, not less likely. And I think we'll have a budget debate. And if Republicans aren't going to do a government shutdown, that will be a back and forth negotiation. So I think we're much more likely to get a real negotiation around that if there isn't a shutdown than when a gun is to one side's head. Or
When you say a budget, you mean, as Bill said, that they actually pass a budget resolution, or something that makes a noticeable difference in the long-run trajectory of the federal deficit?
Well, I think that's a big issue. I mean, obviously, in the next year or so, they're going to start hitting up against the sequester. We've had a 2-year budget debate, and we have a 2-year budget window, and that's going to close. So we need another budget. I think there's a really open question whether you could have a big deal or not, and that's just going to be a determination of how much. I think that has really been a challenge between sort of moderate and conservative forces, most particularly in the House. So I think that's a large open question. There's definitely, the president has been willing to negotiate on those issues. So,
Alice, what do you think is most likely to happen if something happens?
Well, I would put trade at the top. I think that going back to the Clinton experience with NAFTA, that is a space in which you need Republican support, and this president would have it. I think I would go with corporate tax reform too. The president, after all, put out something that was revenue neutral. Some of us didn't think it should be, but he's on record there, and there's a lot of common ground on the corporate tax reform. We do need to get the rates down. They're out of line with other countries. But I would put one more thing on the list, and that's infrastructure. There is a considerable bipartisan, not consensus perhaps, but feeling that we have underfunded infrastructure, that's good for long-run growth. It's a good governmental thing to do, and I think you could, if you worked hard at it, engineer a substantial infrastructure bill. I don't think they'll do a long-run deal on the budget. The urgency is sort of off now. It's much less urgent to do that than it was a couple of years ago.
Rudy, you mentioned corporate tax reform. Let me ask you the two things that I think are big obstacles. One is that if you want to make it revenue neutral, it's hard to avoid dealing with the pass-throughs and the companies that, well, they're not organized as the subchapter S companies, the ones who are very influential and part of the Republican base. So as soon as you start to shift some of the burden away from big subchapter C corporations to S, you run into some political issues. And secondly, I think I've lost count of the number of business coalitions on tax reform. They all have these great names, but there's basically the multinationals who care about the international tax, the capital-intensive companies that like lower rates as long as you don't do away with depreciation, the R&D heavy companies, the intellectual property heavy companies, and so it seems to me that the fracturing of the business community makes it less likely this will happen.
Well, I'm afraid you're right about all of that. There are very serious barriers. I got very depressed at a New Year's Eve party where I met a lobbyist who was busy putting together a coalition to preserve LIFO accounting for inventories. And I think you're right that paying for it is very difficult. But especially because in Dave Camp's proposal, one of the major ways of paying for things was, in the short run at least, was to go to more realistic business depreciation. He's essentially dropped that now, and he got a lot of opposition from...
And he won't be there in the next conference.
And he won't be there, no. So that's one thing you got to substitute for, and maybe as you say, you've got to substitute for some of the pass-throughs as well. I think where they might come on all of that is that instead of moving to a pure territorial system of taxation, they might indeed leave some residual tax on repatriations and even on earnings abroad. It seems to me you could raise some revenues there to facilitate some change. I think they will also find some magical revenues through dynamic scoring. I think you may well see that. So I do think there's a way forward, even though I would certainly agree with you that there are major barriers as well. On the overall budget picture, I think it was distressing to see how many Republican candidates were running to increase spending on defense, for example. And indeed, some groups even attacked Democrats who ventured good words about Social Security reform. So I think that shows how far down the whole problem of the deficit is sunk both in the political discourse and in the public discourse.
Bill?
I agree with Alice. First of all, no grand bargains. That's finished. Even on the small bore list, I have a long list. I began not the next Congress, but I think it's a real chance that the House will pass it this afternoon. The Senate, I think, will pass an extra keystone. I think that's a given. I also think repeal of the medical device tax is coming very quickly. It will come in the next Congress. I agree with Alice. I think there is opportunity in a bipartisan way on infrastructure. I think there is movement there. We have a highway trust fund that's exhausting at the end of March or April, I believe it is. I also think that we're going to get into, you get into it, I presume, that we will get into the Affordable Care Act. I do believe there will be changes made in a bipartisan manner on the Affordable Care Act. The 30-hour work week moved up to 40 hours. I think reduction in the subsidies up to 400% of poverty. I think those will be on the table. I think there are lots of areas there. On corporate tax reform, this is where I guess my pessimism kicks in, and you highlighted. It's hard for me to believe that you can pass corporate tax reform without getting into individual tax reform with the S corporations and pass-throughs. And I just can't see going into the 2016 election for Republicans only focusing on corporate and not individual, reducing corporate tax rates but not individual. I'm very pessimistic about corporate tax reform in that context.
One of the decisions that the new leadership of Congress is going to have to make is likely to pick a successor to Doug Elmendorf at the Congressional Budget Office. Now, Rudy, you mentioned dynamic scoring. I don't think it was approvingly. Could you talk a little bit about why it matters? What kind of person is the next director of CBO?
Well, dynamic scoring wouldn't be at the top of my list in that regard. I think it's fairly important that the director be an economist, not essential. They can hire somebody as a deputy who can do critical evaluations of the work the staff does, but it's very important to have those critical evaluations. It has to be somebody who can get along with both political parties. It can't be some highly partisan person. And it has to be somebody with a very thick skin, because you get beat up a lot when you're CBO director.
Anybody else want to weigh in? Alice?
Well, let me just reinforce, I think it's very important that they pick a very competent professional. I don't think it has to be an economist. Dan Crippen was not an economist.
Bill Hoagland's not an economist.
Bill Hoagland.
I'm an ag economist.
He's an honorary.
Catch him.
But I think it has to be a very competent professional person with budget knowledge and the confidence of both sides, because no matter what, the CBO director has to make some close calls and will be under attack, and the best way to be under attack, because you have to be, is from both sides.
Can I just pick up where Rudy was on dynamic scoring? I think there's no question that there are behavioral responses to changes in marginal tax rates. I think that's a given. I think what we have to be very careful about dynamic scoring just on the tax side is that I could sit here and make the argument there are dynamic effects on the spending side.
Yes.
Long-term investments in infrastructure, long-term investments in education, those have a dynamic effect on the economy. So you be very careful about what you wish for here. If you go down the road of dynamic scoring on the tax side, you may find yourself also in a position of having to say, we have dynamic scoring on spending, and that bothers me in terms of the overall spending pattern of this country.
Could I also add, it's very important to differentiate dynamic scoring from dynamic analysis. I mean, I think we should do as much dynamic analysis as we can. I think in terms of scoring, I mean, what typically happens when a bill is being formulated in committee is maybe at 10 o'clock at night, you know, they add some language or they add a comma here or a sentence there that really changes the economic effects of the bill. And they want an answer, a score from CBO by the opening of business the next morning. And typically CBO people work all night to do a static analysis. I just don't think it's practical really to do very much dynamic scoring. There just isn't time.
And there's no end to the requests if you once start down that line. Bill and I were at a meeting this week on the very laudable subject of reducing obesity. We're all for that. But there was sentiment that the CBO was standing in the way of reducing obesity because they wouldn't score programs that pretend to reduce obesity as savings for the government. I happen to think that's nonsense, mostly because we don't know how to reduce obesity. But that's the line you'd be going down if you said we're going to dynamic score everything.
Neera, let me ask you a different question. Rudy made an assertion, I think it was Rudy, that some of what happens in the next couple of years depends on how the president plays this. And he made the view that the president shouldn't be confrontational. Looks like he's off to a pretty aggressive start in the last few days. What do you think's happening, and what do you think would be a wise strategy for the White House now?
So I think to step back, it's been a pretty effective strategy, I think, for I'll put on a kind of maybe partisan hat here. Not much has happened in the last couple of years. That's definitely the fault of both sides. But we've had some challenges and not much happening. And I think that has really hurt people because, as I said, I think that's hurt the White House and Democrats because people see them as the incumbent party. So I think the line the president's navigating is that there are things that people are still hurting in the country. On immigration reform, there is a challenge, which is that we have had increased deportations over the last couple of years. There's a lot of pent-up demand. And if you look at Election Day, it's not particularly a political audience, a lot of people stayed home because I think they're losing faith that Washington can deliver for them, at least on the kind of Democratic side. Definitely a lot of people angry at Washington too, and that motivated a lot of voters. So I think that the issue here is there's definitely, there's definitely a conventional wisdom in Washington, which is to both sides work together, don't take any aggressive action. On immigration reform, the tough issue here really is that it's like Lucy and the football, because Boehner's been talking about producing a bill for a long time. There was a Senate passed bill last year. So at some point, I think the challenge is for the president is he's just not delivering on some kind of key promises made. because he's waiting for the House, not even the Senate, the House to act on something that's difficult for them. It's difficult for me to see how we're going to get action on immigration reform when candidates ran this cycle and won with very anti-immigrant ads from Joni Ernst from Iowa to New Hampshire. These ads haven't been run in recent cycles, but they were very anti-immigrant ads. So you can always say, let's wait, but then at some point, it just seems like the president is risking being seen as ineffectual. And that is also a challenge going forward.
Bill, you look distressed.
I understand where.
Hold the mic. You got to talk with one hand and hold the mic with the other. This business of
I understand where Neera's coming from. I just think the strategy is wrong, Neera. The timing is not good. It's not just immigration. It's net neutrality. It's on the climate side. It's a number of regulations that are coming down beginning on December the 1st, and I think some finalized ones on January the 1st. This is not the time to be putting these regulations forward. It's time to work with Congress to see let's not start off on a bad relationship. And I'm afraid this is going to poison the well. The best I can say is if he goes down this route, I honestly believe you're not going to see immigration reform. Give Congress a chance. I think they can do something on immigration reform. I agree it's probably not comprehensive, and I also agree that goes probably to the next presidential election too. But they will do something on, I'm not an immigration expert, they'll do something on the border, they'll do more security, and let's work in that vein, not do this through executive orders.
Let me let Alice weigh in and then Rudy.
There's a difference between working with Congress and bargaining with Congress. And all the business people in the room know the difference between a negotiation and just a let's get together. You don't lead with where you want to come out if you're a good negotiator. Democrats are not terribly good negotiators, I think, but Clinton actually was. And people now think that was a happy period in which he and Gingrich sat down together and made a deal. It was nothing of the kind. It was very unpleasant and accusations flying back and forth. But in the end, on the budget, on welfare reform, on several things, they came out with a package that both sides could accept. And that is what has got to happen here, and I don't see it happening at the moment.
Well, I couldn't agree with Bill more. I think if the president does start issuing these orders, it will truly be a disaster. Nothing then will get done subsequently. Indeed, quite the reverse. I think the president has shown through past behavior he really doesn't like talking to Republicans very much. But I think he really does have to if
some Democrats on the Hill says he doesn't like talking to them either.
Well, that's true, yes. But I think he should engage in a very vigorous charm offensive. I happened to be with a bunch of senators soon after he had the dinner at the Jefferson Hotel about about budget issues, and they were charmed. They really were. One eminent Republican said, "I found I really like the president personally, but don't expect me to admit it in public." The effects of such initiatives are really quite dramatic because the President of the United States has a very big influence on people when he deals with them closely. Going back to the Reagan administration, I think President Reagan and Speaker O'Neill had lunch almost every week.
Neera?
So I think this conversation kind of illustrates something, which is, I think the president should do more on reaching out to folks. But just your comments very specifically made clear, the president reached out to a bunch of folks in April, May, June, and I think as business leaders, people can all recognize you have to do that. You should do it continually. It shouldn't be a one-off. But I think we're losing sight of the fact that there are structural issues here that are difficult to navigate. So, just going off what Bill said about immigration reform, I'm absolutely confident the House Republicans could pass a border bill. I think you're right. If that's immigration reform, that's doable. But I think the challenge we have is that we've gone through a couple of years now where we had a Senate pass with a lot of Republican support an immigration reform bill. And so I don't think, like, from the president's perspective, a border bill alone is going to be a place to come together around. So I think the challenge the president is facing is that there are people, in the country, not just on the Democratic side, who are losing faith that anything can happen that affects anyone anymore in Washington. And the irony of all of this conversation to me is that if you look at exit polls, people are really anxious about broad economic facts in the country. They're very anxious about the fact, Republicans and Democrats, that the American dream isn't going to be there for them.
Okay,
That there's
so-
wages. Can I just
Yeah.
finish, please? And I think the challenge here is if nothing is happening in Washington and the president keeps waiting, he looks also ineffectual to people in the broad public.
Bill?
Neera, could I just ask if, fine, then would you, if they're still listening to you in the White House, will you make one recommendation? That if he's going,
They're not going to.
well, if they're going to issue this immigration regulation, wait until the 113th Congress sine dies, because I am very worried that if he does this before they sine die, it'll show up on the continuing resolution, and then we may go through, darn it.
So
Government
that was too inside the beltway here. You mean if the president does the immigration order, you're afraid that in the spending bill to keep the government open, they will try and tie his hands, and then we'll have a bigger risk of a shutdown. So it's okay if he does it, just wait till January. That's Bill's.
But he needs something
Yeah.
to force them to the table.
Right.
And if the threat of doing the executive order can do that, it would be a good thing. He's made clear that he wants a bill. And by a bill, he doesn't mean border control. He means a bill that has a path to citizenship or path to legality. I'm not sure where we are on that. For the substantial number of people who've been here for a long time, have family here, and haven't done anything wrong. I think there's a substantial number of Republicans who want that too. And the question is, how do you make it happen? And he hasn't made it happen yet.
Let me pick up on something Neera said. So I think probably everybody at CED would agree that if you define the big picture economic challenges of the country and oversimplify a little, we don't have enough, the growth rate is too slow, and it's a little worrisome that the potential growth rate has been marked down a little bit. So there's a pace of growth in the economy, and the growth that we have had has been disproportionately going to people at the top, so the median hasn't grown even as fast as the top line. So moving from the near term a bit and what's possible, what is it that public policy could do to address either one of those things? Either the average growth rate or the distribution questions. Bill, do you want to start? What would you put on your list of things that could be done?
And this one I may agree totally. I put at the top of the list economic advancement of economic opportunity. And how do you do that? It's difficult, but I do think it goes back to something as basic as the educational and the workforce training, making our workforce better prepared for a future out there in terms of the jobs that are out there, training for them, modifications to our educational system. I am very worried about the student loan program and the debt that that's creating on our students and what they're going to have to do. So I then come back, tie it all the way back to the big picture, which really worries me about the long-term future of this country, and that's the level of debt. Unfortunately, that puts me back into the category of talking about the most unpopular things to talk about, and that's fundamental changes to our tax code, eliminating a number of credits, deductions, exclusions, lowering the tax rates, broadening the base. I also think it puts us back into the situation of, unfortunately, having to talk about Social Security, modification of the Social Security, reduce the, extending the age of retirement. Also, I think we have to build upon some of the positive aspects of the Affordable Care Act, and that is to continue to move us away from the fee-for-service to a more patient-oriented type of system. So I think
It's
there's a
going to be
lot
hell
to
the first 100 days in the Hoagland presidency.
I know, but
Rudy?
no, you were long-term.
I know, I'm with you, I appreciate it. Rudy?
Well,
You can pick one of Bill's 300 things.
Going to the state of the economy, I really do think, aside from claims that overregulation and other things are holding us back, I do think we're suffering from sort of a post-traumatic stress syndrome. We're having gone through this recession where a lot of people had a near-death experience. People are really very hesitant to commit themselves to big investments or even to hiring. But one of the things that is adding to that feeling is the disorder in Washington. Now, I don't know how you fix that, but I hear more and more from businessmen, you know, what are policies going to be? They have no idea. Will there be corporate tax reform? Will there be any action on the deficit? It's this policy uncertainty, and there's some academic research that suggests that it has an effect, is really holding us back. So we got to fix up Washington, as easy as that will be.
Alice, what would you do?
Let me come back to my infrastructure bill. That fits with the things that Bill wants to do about education and training, with which I agree, although I don't think there's a huge amount we can do in Washington that changes education or even makes workforce training more effective. That's got to come from the local level and from the business community, both doing it and pushing on the local level to get it done.
So I guess I would differ a little bit in my analysis of what the challenges are in the economy from maybe some folks here on the panel. I'll just be brief. We did an analysis, a cap on a prototypical family. It was about a month and a half ago. Prototypical family in the U.S., kind of median wage in a high wage state. It's two parents working, 2 children. We looked at that kind of same family in 2001 and 2012. In 2012, that family has $5,000 less in disposable income because their wages have pretty much stagnated and costs have gone up. Those costs are childcare costs, healthcare costs, education costs, particularly higher education costs. To me, that's kind of a framework of what the challenge is, because we have lower demand than we would otherwise have because wages have been stagnant in the country. And that's a kind of global phenomenon, but it's actually more acute in the U.S. than other countries because other countries have actually had median wage growth much higher than the U.S. And probably Canada now has the richest middle class in the world. So I think this, to me, is kind of one of the central challenges of our time, which is those families are really stressed out, and it's a kind of moral challenge for political leaders. But it's an economic challenge for the country because they're not buying goods, and we're still 70%. They're not buying as many goods, and we're still a heavy consumer demand related economy. So to me, I think political leaders have to actually think about how to address those problems. And the problem we have in the country is that the leadership is so polarized, we can't even identify the challenges. Though interestingly enough, more and more conservatives are talking about this wage squeeze. Eric Cantor was actually kind of a forward thinker on this wage squeeze. I wouldn't agree with him on many of his solutions, but I'm glad he's actually talking about this set of challenges. And I worry that in Washington, infrastructure is something that would help create more. It would create more jobs, which would create more pressure on wages to go up if we had if we had lots
And
of
it's
jobs.
also good for productivity in the
Very good
longer
for
run.
productivity, but also, I mean, in our experience of the last 30 years, the one time we had real wage pressure up was when we had very low unemployment, right? So that to me is the is part of the strategy. Let's try to help create more jobs. We can think of conservative or liberal ways to do that. But I think we're talking aside from the problem. And the thing I took on election day is that's what voters are really concerned about. They feel really stressed out. Some of them are more worried about costs. Others are more worried about wages, but these are the issues front and center for them. And so I hope I'll be optimistic that Congress will deal with some of this, but political leaders are not going to deal with it at their peril.
Let me take advantage before we turn to the audience to the fact that we have a couple of you who know a lot about what's going on with healthcare costs. One of the reasons, Alice, that there's a couple of reasons why the deficit is less scary now than it was a few years ago. The economy's better. Congress did raise taxes, and the sequester, for better or worse, did restrain spending some. And interest rates are very low. But another reason is that I think it's fair to say, to the surprise of many people, the pace of federal government spending on healthcare has slowed. And even though there's more costs associated with the Affordable Care Act, Medicare per capita costs. So is something happening here that you think is going to last? Or is this just some fluke, and that when we get together next year or 2 years from now, we'll be moaning and groaning about excess cost growth?
If it's just a fluke, it's a long fluke. This reduction in the rate of growth of health spending started before the recession, has continued through the recession. I think it is a combination of things, partly that people don't spend on discretionary health if they don't have a lot of extra discretionary income, but also reforms are kicking in. The administration likes to point to the reforms that were in the Affordable Care Act, and I think some of them are effective, but I think it's more than that. The private sector is also understanding that they can put some pressure on healthcare providers to be more efficient, and the insurance industry has discovered competitive bidding and exchanges and things like that, which are also in the Affordable Care Act, and it's reinforcing each other. But not to be too optimistic about this, there are a lot of treatments and therapies and drugs coming down the pike that are going to be very attractive and very expensive, and the population's aging, so we can expect upward pressure as time moves on healthcare spending that isn't going to go away. So the reforms have got to be, we've got to double down on the reforms.
Bill?
Well, I was going to agree with Alice. I think it's absolutely true that the per capita cost has come down, particularly in Medicare, but the number of capitas will be going up, and that's the problem.
Yeah, I think there's a
Or
lot.
a good thing.
Yeah.
Otherwise, it's like, we don't want to wish for death panels or anything. So.
There's a lot about this we don't understand, but I think it's interesting. I think the single most important thing we do understand is that the cost saving was related to the patent cliff in 2012, with a huge number of patents expiring on very widely used drugs, and we were able to substitute generics for that, and Part D expenses actually went down for a while.
But it isn't just Part D.
No, it isn't just Part D. And I agree with you that there are some profound things going on in the background. Indeed, maybe some evolution away from fee-for-service medicine. But how far that will go and how much it'll save, I think we're still a little vague on.
So I would say, I agree with Alice that there's a bunch of things happening. You do see, I think it's hard to distinguish between private and public sector in the sense that you see a lot of private systems are pretty expensive, Massachusetts, Florida, that are responding to the signals that Medicare is sending on moving away from fee-for-service. So I think they're taking reforms on head-on because they think it's coming from the ACA down the road. So it's kind of there's a kind of signal back and forth, and that's really important for HHS to keep sending those signals. I think one of the issues is that it's absolutely the case that we also have a trend of employers bearing more of the out-of-pocket costs of healthcare, which is making them more price sensitive.
Employers or employees?
Employees are bearing more of the cost of healthcare. There's higher deductibles. The deductibles have gone up, cost sharing, copaying. It has a positive effect of making people more cost sensitive. It has a negative effect of eating far more into their income. So again, there's $2,000 higher cost to individuals, that individuals are paying now than in 2001. And so that, that is also actually also serving as a drag on family income. So I think getting that balance right is really important.
Let me turn to questions. There's a woman right here in the front, and after that, Joe Kaiser. Tell us who you are.
Hilda Ochoa, with Strategic Investment Group. I have a complex but nifty question.
And a short one, I hope.
Maybe.
That's your question.
Cannot make it complex and nifty and have it short. I'll make it very short to begin with, which is, what if Congress understood that the key to making the income disparity problem go away relies on immigration reform? That's a short version of the question. Now let me explain why I say that. The reason why you have increasing income disparity in the United States is because the middle class is dying. I mean it literally. The middle class, which is the mode of the population of any country, if you want to be a good country, is essentially populated by baby boomers who are all getting to retirement age. And you become much poorer when you reach retirement age, particularly in a country which has not accumulated savings. So there is a another baby boomer population coming in the millennials, but that's only 20% of the population relative to the 50% of the baby boomers that are retiring. The key to solving that problem is bringing in about 2.5 million immigrants of the right kind, and then repopulating the middle class at the right age.
Okay, so I'll let someone respond, but let me just say, I don't think there's any argument about the economics of immigration among the elites in Washington. So it's not a question of economic logic. It's a question of politics. And when you say, what if Congress understood, you're suggesting that they shouldn't worry about getting reelected. But that's not the incentives they have. If you represent an all-white conservative district, which is frightened because they are seeing a lot of immigrants they think are taking jobs from their kids, it doesn't matter. You can give them all the models you want about the economics of immigration. It's a political issue. Does anybody differ really on that?
Not really. I was recently in Europe and was really taken by the wave of anti-immigration in Europe. It's become quite emotional there. And I'm afraid it's happening here too.
And they have an even more severe demographic problem.
Yeah, they need them more.
And on the economics, I agree with David completely. Quite frankly, I would love to have the immigration reform bills because it will benefit us greatly on the deficit side. But you said something at the end that bothered me just a little. You said the right people. And I'm not quite sure what that means when you say the right people. If it's the STEM, if it's my future son-in-law, an MIT Greek geek, is that the right person, or is it the young couple in Mexico trying to get a better life? I'm not quite sure what that means.
It's both. It's both. It's a diverse distribution of people.
Okay, Alice?
No, I agree with that.
Okay, Joe? And someone raise your hand is next, so Mike can find you way in the back in the white shirt.
Joe Casputi, CED trustee. The panel mentioned political uncertainty can be holding back investment and job growth in the private sector, and that's very consistent with surveys that the CED has done of its own trustees, where we get people reporting to us that they're doing exactly that, holding back and creating jobs in the United States, holding back on investment. Over the past years, we've seen a lot of alerts that we need serious structural reform. We've had the super committee, we've had the bipartisan policy center, we've had the Simpson-Bowles commission, we've had CED has its own view on this, that we had to do something about the long-term problem that we see looming in the decade of the 2020s. I'm just like to ask the panel, will we ever address that, or will it be addressed only on the margin? Things that we can do in the Congress today, trade, infrastructure, revenue neutral tax reform will all promote growth. And maybe that's all we're going to get. But are we ever going to take up the big problem that all those different groups that I mentioned looked at so hard in the past couple of years?
Alice?
I don't know whether when we will address the long run problem. But I think the priorities are right now to grow the economy faster. And remember, that's part of the solution to the long run debt. That's what we did after World War II. We didn't pay off the debt. We didn't even reduce it. We just grew the economy faster than the debt was increasing. So that's a positive right now, and I think it's the priority. The debt to GDP ratio is uncomfortably high. And if we have another recession, we're sort of stuck because there's not much we can do about it that wouldn't exacerbate the debt further. So that's a very important reason for turning to Social Security reform and Medicare reform. But as we said earlier, it's not nearly as urgent now as it looked when we did Simpson-Bowles and Domenici-Rivlin.
Bill?
Before I forget it, we've gone all this time and not one word has been said about Dodd-Frank, and I should put back on the list that I do believe that a Republican-controlled Senate will take up Dodd-Frank modification, not a repeal, just like the ACA, not a repeal, but modifications to it. On your question, I agree with Alice. Right now, it's not the issue, and my problem is that when it becomes an issue, it will be too late because it will be a crisis. And the part that worries me more than anything else is that when those interest rates start moving back up to normalization in the 10 years, then the fastest growing component of the federal budget is not Social Security, Medicare, it's just paying the interest on the public debt. And that, I guess it's when we have a crisis, I guess I'm going to have to be, here I'll be pessimistic. That's when we'll get serious.
Rudy, you seem...
Well, the safest forecast in the world is that we will address the problem.
And just don't put a date on it, right?
Because it's unsustainable. So I think what Bill says is right. We may have to wait for a crisis. The hardest thing in the world to predict is when that crisis might occur. But it should be something that both the left and the right should try and avoid like the plague. When you look at what's happened in Europe, social benefits have been cut arbitrarily, taxes have been raised arbitrarily. That's something that no one should want.
Neera, let me ask you, let me reframe that a little bit. Okay, so what they've said is that there's no immediate need to address the long-term budget crisis because the deficit's relatively low now, and if we can get growth going faster, the debt to GDP ratio will be lower than it would have been otherwise. But it seems to me there is a cost to not acting now, and that is that interest, Social Security, and Medicare take an ever bigger slice of the budget, and all the things that you want to do in investment in the discretionary area get squeezed because that's about the only thing that Congress is actually cutting. Isn't that like a bad strategy?
Yeah, so that's why we've always been for a balanced plan that addresses long-term rates. CAP has been a strong supporter of. We recognize that we have kind of immediate economic challenge, but over the long term, you could make decisions today that wouldn't be so painful to avoid decisions down the road. I mean, I think we should have some realism, though, and it was referenced, but. Cutting Social Security and Medicare were fodder of campaigns, and Democrats were attacked by super PACs, Crossroads, GPS, super PAC, unloaded ads against Democrats, particularly Kay Hagan, for saying something positive about Simpson-Bowles. So, I mean, just given how, I think that it's fascinating how the kind of conventional wisdom position moved in like literally 2 cycles to one that's fodder for attack. So it's hard for me to see, given that level of politicization. And I want to commend Alan Simpson, attacked those ads. It was, it's not like people recognize that problem. But when there's that level of politicization, it's very difficult.
Okay, so the guy in the back, let me take 2 or 3 questions.
here. Does anybody, and there's another guy in the back. So we'll take those 3 questions, and then people can answer the ones they want and duck the ones they want. So, gentleman in the back first.
Thank you. My name is Dimitri Melhorn. I'm with an investment network across borders that invests in early stage technology companies. My question is about corporate tax, and specifically, how will you get a reform that disadvantages individual people? So Alice, you've written about little reforms kind of building momentum. Neera, your group has written that LIFO accounting is an easy win. But Rudy talked about a group getting together to lobby to defend LIFO accounting. And any reform that levels the playing field and broadens the tax base like Bill wants is going to disadvantage somebody, whether it's manufacturers. So can you get the business community to stand up for something like a level corporate tax reform, even though some members will be disadvantaged?
Thank you. The woman over here?
Yes, Paula Stern.
I'm sorry, Paul. It's hard to see people with the lights in your eyes.
That's all right. At least you knew it was a woman. Back just quickly on the trade stuff, because it seemed to be a consensus that that's maybe one area where Congress will move. And E.J. Dionne last week, of course, said, yeah, the Republicans would like to see, movement perhaps on trade because it divides the Democrats most. And so I'm really interested in Neera and others tackling that a little bit more in terms of the long term.
And then there was one in the back, another person in the back.
Yeah, how you doing? Troy Gajewski, a new trustee here. Neera, this is mainly for you, but love to hear everybody else's opinion too. And this isn't a political statement, but do you really think the administration understands the costs of some of the new regulations they unveil versus the benefits? Because it seems from our perspective that they at times maybe ignore them. I don't know.
Okay, so one on corporate taxes, one on the politics of trade, and one on administration thinking about regulation. Rudy, you want to take the corporate tax one?
Okay, well, it's really hard. Nobody should deny that. But I'm old enough that I actually worked on the Hill when the 86 reform was passed. And that was a joint business and individual tax reform. The thing that made it really go was the discipline of revenue neutrality. Because every time somebody wanted to preserve some special deduction, the staff would run out and tell them that then they can't lower the rate very, very much. And it was the appeal of the lower rates that really made that go. And I think it's harder when you just do corporate. But again, I began by saying that I think it's one of the things we just might accomplish, and I still believe that.
Neera?
Can I do trade?
You have to use the mic.
Oh, sorry. Usually my voice carries. But. So on trade and the cleavages in the Democratic Party, I think the big challenge is that, and it's not just in the Democratic Party, there's a confusion in the country between globalization and trade deals. So actually public polling on trade deals is pretty negative, not just Democrats. There's a fair number of Tea Party voters who are very negative on trade deals. I think that the issue is, especially on the TPP, if the administration can negotiate a trade deal, as it seems like they're trying to do, that could actually create upward pressure on wages in some countries, then and there's manners which they could do that, minimum wage, establishing minimum wage by the country, but still establishing a minimum wage. Then I think you could actually alleviate some of the concern. But the broad public feels that globalization, trade, whatever term you want to use, has moved jobs overseas, created downward pressure on wages. So I think that's an issue. I think that it would be great if more of the business community could speak to how trade deals could actually be a competition up rather than down.
Before you go, Bill, can you just respond a little bit to does the administration underestimate the costs of regulation?
I mean, I'm always anxious to hear about the particularities of that. We're always open to, we believe competitiveness is a huge important challenge for the country. It's just a little hard to recognize, to address that as an abstract issue. They actually had Cass Sunstein there, whose whole job was to do that. I think the thing that people lose sight of, like on the EPA rules, for example, that would be a kind of prototypical discussion of costs and benefits. Those are always values determinations, what is on one side and what's on the other. So as a policymaker, you could argue that you should think about costs and benefits in particular ways. But the debate you're really having on that, usually in most cases, is someone just values something more than the other.
Bill and then Alice.
I didn't think Neera was going to address the question, so I'm sticking it in here only because I think, no, they do not. They are required by law to publish those regulations in the Federal Reserve. They're supposed to show the cost estimates, and then the cost estimates then are out there for the public. The EPA regulation coming down on small go zone on December the 1st is one of the most costly regulations to the business community as I can see right now. All I would suggest is there ought to be a way in which those regulations ought to have some, since the executive's not doing it, the legislative branch should be able to review those under a fast-track procedure.
Alice?
Well, I just wanted to throw in the idea that one of the reasons we have all these complex EPA regulations is that we aren't willing to do something sensible like a carbon tax or even cap and trade. There are more market-oriented ways of doing these things that would get better results at less cost, but we don't do them.
With that, I want you, Al, do you want to?
No.
Please join me in thanking the panel for a great discussion.